All right. I think we are all here. Thank you so much, everyone. My name is Saul Saravia, and I am going to be moderating the panel today, which I wanted to start with an expression of gratitude to all of you for coming on a Saturday morning to help folks think through the ideas that they're working on for what their papers, their presentations are going to be about today. It's such an important part of what happens at these conferences, and sometimes the thing that actually helped inspire somebody to, really take the leap in their own integration of their practice and the work that happens in institutions like this that are supposed to be about production of knowledge. And so what you're doing today, just being in conversation with us, is vital to the larger Critical Race Project. And if you're a student in particular, I just want to acknowledge you for showing up and coming and being a part of it, because for me, one of the most important parts of the origin story of critical race theory was learning that one of the initial genesis moments was when Derek Bell, the founder of the field, was basically told by Harvard that there was not a single black woman anywhere on the globe who could be hired, qualified enough to teach at Harvard. He chose to leave, and there was a gap in who would teach the classes that he normally teaches. And Kim Crenshaw, who was a student at the time, and others rejected the solution that Harvard gave them, was to bring who they considered to be the leading civil rights leaders at the time and offer sort of a replacement civil rights course, which was not the same as what Derek Bell was doing in his courses on race, racism, and American law. And they set this field into motion as students through what was called the alternative course, which was essentially, I imagine it, a group of students of all races who wanted more critical perspectives on race, saying to Harvard, whose own self-conscious identity and perception in the world is this is the place where the smartest people thinking the smartest things are convened, and essentially ran their own course and invited some of the folks who wrote the canonical pieces in critical race theory to basically do lectures and be in a discussion like what we want to do today. So I just want to lift up those of you who are here for this and remind us of that history, that even though these folks went on to become leaders of an entire new field of study, they radically transformed how we think about ethnic studies, how we think about law, how we think about legal education. They started off where you are if you're a student, who just, something didn't feel right about what they were being told. And secondly, my gratitude is to the panelists, because they didn't apply to put together this panel. They have individual projects that happen to all relate to work that is about, on different levels, confronting the carceral state and the logics of carcerality, and really doing that in a way that tries to live up to another tenet of critical race theory that emerged from that alternate course, which is actually teaching about race and racism through law is not enough. It has to be a multidisciplinary approach. It has to bring in an analysis of all of the disciplines that we use to try to understand why a problem exists in the world and how it could be different. And what these folks are going to do today is expose us to different methodological or disciplinary approaches that we have at our disposal as people who are legally trained, to analyze specific expressions of this monster of carcerality, and how folks on the ground, whether they're bringing cases or trying to pass laws and policies or leading organizing campaigns as activists, are all trying to chip away and give birth to something new. And so for me, as somebody who's an organizer, that's my primary identity, that has had one foot inside the academy and one foot outside of the academy, helping social movement actors carry out this type of social change work. It was indeed a real great honor to be asked to moderate today's panel. And we've had a couple planning meetings where we were just surprised that we've run in the same circles but haven't just yet met. So it's great that we're here for this. Before I ask each of the panelists to share a little bit about themselves and the work that they are doing, and I want to invite you to feel comfortable sharing a little bit about your background. So it would be good for folks to know what your current day job is or what your next job is going to be. But I also think you should you should give yourself some time to share a little bit about who you are and why you chose to go down this path, if you want to do that. Then we're going to start in the order with Felipe, who will go first. You can do that introduction and then go straight into your 10 minutes. You can have up to 10 minutes. And then I'll just have Eric, who's going second, and Dave, who's going third, do the same thing. So do your own introduction and go right into your presentation, and we'll move on to the next person.
Okay.
And then when we do that, when we complete that, we want to open it up for a discussion. We're here until 11:30, so we really want to get to that point. The last thing I want to say is, how many of you have been here since the first night? Raise your hand. Okay, so maybe half of us. I just wanted to lift up a few of the themes that I'm hearing at this critical juncture, not just for the field, but for the entire project of American democracy, that have come up that I think it's important to emphasize as we move into a conversation about the carceral state and the machinery of detention, the machinery of policing, the logics of caging human beings, and what people are doing about it, that is important for us to keep in mind to sort of tie to create the through line from what's been discussed here so far. So one theme that I heard and that has emerged as something that we have to keep in mind is that from its inception, critical race theory is the product of a dialectic between theorizing the problem of racism and practicing how to address racism. And this praxis is what made it controversial from the beginning. Some of you may have seen the quote from Professor Cheryl Harris where she says, we weren't just trying to understand the vexed relationship between race and the law, we were wanting to do something to change it, right? And so this point of departure is really important for us to keep in mind, that it is, I think, a false dichotomy to think about critical race theory and what is happening here, whether you're a student or a faculty member, and critical race practice, which is what a lot of us are engaged in around this question. It is essential that we continue to think about these as mutually constitutive. That is, that they are, the people who have gone into this field are often animated by the kinds of stuff that happens when we're doing activism and we're trying to make sense of it. And we're attracted to critical race theory because other fields give us a limited set of tools and concepts to really name those dynamics that are upholding the status quo. And I think to keep in mind that whatever track you decide to go on, which is to help us theorize, right? Help us have a conceptual framework that will allow us to abolish ideas and systems that hold up the status quo, or you're going to be a practitioner, or both. We need all of it, right? But what we need to do is be in conversation with each other about what we're learning along the way. That's one theme that I wanted to lift up. The other thing I wanted to lift up is there was actually music to my ears, a reference to Gramsci and the concept of hegemony. And one of the things that Cheryl Harris offered up on the first day is like in the theorizing about how power works, one of the concept we've been offered is that there are periods in which these unstable projects of oppression feel very repressive, and we go into a defensive and protective mode for the protection of our folks, right? For our survival, but that these are also moments of great opportunity, right? And that these are moments where things that might not be visible become visible because the instability of the project itself becomes revealed. And also because people who might have otherwise felt like certain things weren't necessary or were too radical, all of a sudden, because of the material conditions they're experiencing, are open to new ideas, new ways of thinking about how society should be organized. And that as organizers, as thinkers, our job is to be disciplined and to have some offering, an analysis, a way out that reaches for the most radical proposition, right? So that we don't end up back in the same place and then having to understand, why didn't that other strategy go as far as it should have? So this is a great moment to think about the opportunities that we have in front of us to disrupt and to do something different. So with that, I would like to hand it over to our panel and to just emphasize that the title, Justice on the Ground, and LA as a site of this tension is a really great opportunity to think about what it means that this particular school of critical race theory at UCLA is so well positioned to be able to align with movements on the ground that are doing this same thing, right? They're analyzing, they're assessing conditions, right? When people decide, are we gonna organize an ICE watch, right? What are we gonna do about anti-Black racism in a city where the population of African Americans is below 10%, but the model of multiracial solidarity is a model that comes from the Black political project, right? We have a Black mayor, we have the Black leader of the city council representing districts where the project of redlining concentrated Black population, but even though we hear Latino politicians say this is a Latino city, why don't we have a Latino mayor? We have a far more important lesson to learn, which is how does the population that is in a numerical majority continuously offer us up ways to organize that are beyond the reach of just a demographic strategy for power. And I think for me as an organizer, that's an important lesson for us to continue to work on. And the last thing I'll say about these 3 papers and why I was so excited about moderating this panel is that in the solutions that they're offering, I want you to listen for the examples from the Black radical tradition, that an abolitionist tradition, that they are bringing to bear in the solutions that they want to offer today. So with that, I'll hand it over to Felipe.
So thank you so much, and thank you all. Buenos días, good morning. My name is Felipe Hernández. Preferred pronouns are him, he, and él. I grew up in Compton, California, Paramount, California, which this year was the site of the uprisings of resistance against the ICE raids for this summer. And I was on the ground there. And at the time I was working for a corporate law firm, and being there, being first gen, and thinking that this is the place I need to be in order to get some kind of social mobility as a lawyer. Being on the ground and being faced with smoke bombs and tear gas really changed my perspective. No matter how much capital I acquire, they will just still see me as a brown man, a threat. And it also brought into light a pivot for me in my career and why I went to law school. Shortly thereafter, I applied to be a lawyer at the Civil Rights ACLU, National Prison Project, where I'm there now. I'm working on challenging the expansion of the immigration detention regime, working on bringing cases against Alabama Alcatraz, some of the growing immigration detention center here in California, and working in partnership with folks who are resisting the expansion of the immigration Cajun machine, from its enforcement, its surveillance, to its expansion to include people who are not only non-citizens, but also people who are labeled as citizens but are deemed threats to the regime because they oppose what the government is doing. I went to Harvard Law School, and there was my first real introduction to organizing in the critical race studies space. We actually did a self-study group and learned about the history of Derek Bell. And we helped organize the first and second annual conferences at Harvard Law School, myself and a couple of comrades there. And we also organized some other teach-ins, and we were criminalized by the Harvard Law School. and they even threatened to expel us and withhold our degrees. So again, there was a reminder that even in those spaces, you are not safe from people who are in power, and indeed we had individuals who were in power. Dean of Students who was a member of our community in terms of demographics. And so there was another lesson that just because they look like us doesn't mean they are us, right? They're with us. And so that's a really important lesson. My article is one that I started writing actually in 2018 during the first Trump administration. And then I kind of put it on pause, and I continued to write it during the Biden administration. And now this summer, I finally was able to get through it and write it and finish it. And what I've learned through that process is that the immigration caging machine has increased and continued to expand. So the central thesis that I had there is that the United States has built a sprawling immigration caging machine through bipartisan lawmaking, privatization, capitalist privatization, surveillance, militarized enforcement that normalizes indefinite detention, and racialized policing as a tool to maintain the racial capitalist and settler colonial project that is the United States. In short, immigration detention is here to stay because the United States needs it as a project for racial capitalism. So we can either see that as a way of, oh, but there's nothing we can do, or we can accept it as it is and no longer give in to the remedial tools, the limited remedial tools that offer only limited reform with the system. And so from that, in the article, I look at sanctuary cities because that is where we are in California, that's where we are in Los Angeles. I remember the organizing of sanctuary cities in California and Los Angeles specifically. It wasn't an easy battle. People, elected officials opposed it. They were worried, particularly when there were Democrats in federal government, that there might be an issue of them not cooperating with the federal government for immigration enforcement. But now we live in a sanctuary state. And so I really look at that as a neoliberal intervention and what that really means. But sanctuary from its inception comes from abolitionist traditions. Thinking about maroonage for people who escaped enslavement, plantation, and they lived in communities along with people from different cultures. In Mexico, for example, people marooned and they built sanctuary areas where they resisted the racial capitalist state either in Mexico or in the United States. So those are some of the roots of sanctuariness, but it's been sort of co-opted now by the neoliberal system here. That we have sanctuary really means that as they practice it here in the United States and Los Angeles, that police are prohibited from cooperating with federal immigration enforcement. And the placing the deference to police officers is really problematic, and that's really what I untangle in my piece, because I look at that it's insufficient to place, and also contradictory, to place the power in the hands of police officers who, as we know and have experienced in the ICE raids this summer, for example, they merely continue to expand the logics of policing and harm on our communities. We saw many instances where sheriffs, LAPD, were indeed protecting ICE officers and firing tear gas on protesters, myself included, maybe some folks here in this room. So I also look at the machine and how it operates and how it's expanded, and how the immigration detention system from Ellis Island to Alligator Alcatraz really is also a byproduct of the mass incarceration system here in the United States that has inflicted people who are citizens, but that citizenship is really not a protective mechanism. And going back to the abolitionist tradition, we understand that one of the things that abolitionists are fighting for, black abolitionists in particular, was, and it was not a monolith, but some group of black abolitionists were fighting for the expansion of citizenship to include black people here in the United States. And that also is an argument that immigrant rights organizers have tried to advance. So I look at the limitations of sanctuary, and one of the key things that I look at is that sanctuary cities, while critical to, and they have limited cooperation between ICE and local police, they do not fundamentally alter the underlying social political relations, racial and economic regime that produces immigrant disposability. What does that mean? It means that neoliberal Democrats, for example, here still continue to maintain the binary that there's this good immigrant and this bad immigrant. And it's okay if they go against the bad immigrants, right? The criminal immigrants. And we heard that from leaders here in Los Angeles, that they're well equipped to police the bad, but now they're going after the good. And this has been a long-standing issue in the immigrant rights community. This binary only serves to bolster the police state, because as we're seeing, even folks on this panel, folks in this room, we might increasingly be considered the bad in the country. And as this country continues to go more and more into fascism, who is bad is not only a sliding scale, but it's an expanding category of people. So the tactics that are used against individuals here at home who are labeled bad, or Palestinian folks across the world, across the country, or other folks across the country and around the world, like Venezuelan people, for example, who is labeled bad is continually a subjective term. And so that's also what I look at. And I look at Derek Bell's interest convergence theory, which, when the sanctuary state is really premised on this idea that if it benefits the economic, political interest of those who are in power, then sanctuary city is good, and that's where we see its benefits. But however, it does not protect immigrant communities, and it only materializes when they align with domestic, economic, and political interest. And so then I look at abolitionist federalism, which is not a fixed endpoint, but a dynamic and ongoing process aimed at dismantling carceral systems while constructing alternative infrastructure of care, safety, and community. And so I look at what abolitionists were advocating for in the abolition of slavery, for example, not only looking at dismantling the structures that promoted and maintained slavery, but also looking at creating and promoting positive structures for integration to a new society. And so for that, I look at, for example, folks who are organizing at ending all detention contracts in the state and in the city, dismantling jail to ICE transfers, prohibiting warrantless detainers, abolishing gang databases. I look at people, I highlight folks who are in the article who are investing in expanding universal legal protection. For many of us, there is no right to an attorney if you're detained in the immigration detention system. We look at, I also advocate for reinvestment in public goods, housing, healthcare, and really incorporating people who are non-citizens into the political and economic system here. For example, extending the franchise to vote for individuals. While that's a reform, it could be considered a non-reformist reform. And so that's a sort of a summary of the article. And I understand that today abolitionists and organizers, critical race theory organizers, are facing increased repression. And so I thank you all for coming here, and I'm happy to answer any questions after. Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. Okay, we're going to give the floor now to Eric.
Hi, I'm Eric Miller. I'm a professor, my pronouns are he, him. I'm a professor at Loyola Law School, Los Angeles. And also, for the last 20 years, I have been one of the lead attorneys on the two different litigation efforts on behalf of the survivors and descendants of the Tulsa race massacre, which is why the reparations framework is important to me here. And so, how many of you are actually Los Angeles residents? Okay. How many of you know about the existence of sheriff-deputy gangs in Los Angeles? Okay, so most of you. Okay, good. So for over 50 years, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department has operated in black and brown neighborhoods, as well as in the county jails, with sheriff gangs, starting with the white supremacist Viking gang in Linwood. I mean, there was one before that, but they were the first major gang in the 1970s. And if you're an Angelino, you'll know that Linwood was a formerly sundown town that then became racially mixed. And the Vikings appear around about the time that change happens. And then it's expanding into the Banditos in East LA, the Executioners in Compton, the Cowboys and Rattlesnakes in Palmdale and Lancaster, the Posse in Twin Towers Correctional Center, and then a variety of gangs, including the 3000 Boys and the Jump Out Boys in Men's Central Jail. The highest ranked confirmed gang member so far is Paul Tanaka, the former undersheriff of the Los Angeles Sheriff's department, so the second highest ranking official in the sheriff's department. He is a tattooed gang member. He was sentenced by a federal court to 5 years in prison for a conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation into jail violence. He didn't serve the whole of that time, but none of that concerned his sheriff deputy gang affiliation. So, to be clear, these gangs have targeted black and brown people for murder and other acts of violence, and have retaliated against family members who have dared to complain about these activities. After an 18-month investigation into the gangs by the Los Angeles Civilian Oversight Commission, I think it's fair to say in large part, but not wholly, prompted by my colleague Sean Kennedy, who was head of the Civilian Oversight Commission at the time, families of victims of gang violence felt that the commission had focused primarily on internal features of the Sheriff's Department and hadn't really addressed their needs or concerns. There was an abortive attempt to hold town halls in various neighborhoods around, impacted neighborhoods around Los Angeles. And so to fill that gap, the Loyola Anti-Racism Center, which I'm a co-director, co-sponsored with Check the Sheriff, Cancel the Contract, Antelope Valley, and Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, all groups representing impacted people, decided to host a convening at Loyola Law School about 2 years ago to discuss reparations for victims of sheriff deputy violence. And we made sure that each panel included either a survivor of a person impacted by sheriff deputy violence, or someone who had been impacted by police violence, representing a variety of local and national organizations. So that included Leslie McSpadden, Michael Brown's mother, Frankie Carrillo, who is a victim of sheriff deputy violence and was wrongfully convicted based on sheriff deputy gang testimony. Helen Jones, mother of John Horton, killed by sheriff deputy gangs. Stephanie Luna, aunt of Anthony Vargas, killed by a sheriff deputy gang member. Mark Clements from Chicago, a victim of the Burge torture regime from the 1990s, now with the Chicago Torture Justice Center. Vinnie Yang, whose sister Jasmine Yang was murdered by LASD deputies, and Paula Minor from Black Lives Matter and Check the Sheriff's Coalition, whose son was murdered by deputies. So, why take a reparations framework? Well, it's important to recognize that reparations is not just a money payment to descendants of enslaved Americans, but from my perspective, it's a harm-based demand that wrongdoers attend to both private injuries to individuals, and so you can get a money payment, but also a public injury to the community. And that then forces us to ask, well, what is the injury? And so it's taken us too long to produce a report, still working on it, but the reason it's taken a long time is that the injury is not just policing, it's the use by Los Angeles County of the police to enforce the violent disappearance and exclusion of people from public spaces based on race and class and immigration criminalization. And it's important to recognize just how violent historical anti-black and anti-brown politics has been, and then ask how can we reconceptualize the justifications that the state, and in this case the county, uses to explain that violence as criminal. And so our goal in the report is to say this isn't about excessive force used by the police. This is part of an intergeneral project of white anti-black and brown violence, and to place the violence in the context of other reparations demands, not just nationally but internationally, so linking it to the troubles in Northern Ireland, to the disappearances in Argentina and in Chile. So the technique that the county uses, but not just the county, it's used nationally, is to characterize black and brown people in public as dangerous, threatening, suspicious, and to play into white fear of contact with black and brown people to justify violently forcing us out of public spaces, which means out of the public political space altogether. And part of the project is, again, working with grassroots organizations from the ground up to describe what is going on with the deputy gangs as part of a long history of Los Angeles violent enforcement of racial hierarchy centered around the carceral control of land and resources. And so part of our lodestar, our sort of North Star, is Kelly Little Hernández's City of Inmates, and she was kind enough to come and speak at our convening. We haven't done nothing, so part of what has been produced by the convening is we do have an Equal Justice Works fellow who's working on this issue and has been for the past 2 years. But what the families at our convening wanted more than money was accountability, freedom from retaliation, security for the remaining family members, and mental and physical health care. I believe that we in Los Angeles County ought to offer more, but that was our participants' major demands. So I want to finish by briefly thinking about reparations and critical race theory to sort of gesture to what we can discuss maybe later. Reparations is complicated in America, in part because, so one way to understand it in the critical race theory tradition is a debate between, you might think, the early black-white binary understanding of critical race theory, which still remains in some aspects of critical race theory, and the lac-crit split that happened in the 90s. And so the question becomes, are we going to adopt a narrow black-focused understanding of reparations, or are we going to adopt a more ecumenical and inclusive understanding of reparations? I'm actually strongly in the ecumenical mode, as you can understand, because these sheriff deputy gangs do not just target black people, do not target people just because, or even primarily because they are descendants of enslaved people. And so I think that we can learn from that in thinking about what reparations should look like. And then just to toss out where I am in the tradition of radical black politics, I think that, let's say, in addition to Angela Davis and her tradition, we need to recapture Ida B. Wells's tradition and recognize that what is going on is not just the politicization of political revolutionaries, but ordinary black and brown people on the street politicized as criminals. And we need to recapture their lives, our lives, and the lives of the people that have been disappeared as unfairly politicized by the LA County, but also the larger state, in order to think about what reparations and health looks like in the black and brown communities in Los Angeles.
Thank you, Eric. Okay, we're going to move to our third panelist, Ade. Give you the floor.
Okay, thank you everybody for just being here today. My name's Ade Jackson. I'm a graduate of UCLA in the CRS program in 2019, so it's kind of crazy. I was in here taking civil procedure just a few years ago, and now getting the chance to speak to you all is really wonderful. I just want to start off by just saying all power to the people, as well as wishing everybody a happy Black Panther History Month, because that's what October is. This is the month when the party was founded, as well as Chairman Bobby Seale's birthday as well, that recently passed. I also just want to acknowledge one of the great ancestors that recently transitioned, Assata Shakur, as she talked about nobody's going to teach you about your true heroes and your true history if it has the potential to set you free, as a paraphrase. And that's a large center of what my work and what I'm doing now. In this paper, I forgot to also introduce, I'm an attorney for the Inner City Law Center now, doing eviction defense. And my paper is titled Forecasting the Evolution of Critical Race Theory, Lessons from the Southern California chapter of the Black Panther Party, as well as Black Lives Matter LA, and local activism. I was really responding to Prompt 9, but I also think it's great that the theme of the entire symposium is think, teach, and transform. And my paper specifically focuses kind of on that last portion of transforming, because that requires doing, right? I really think there's a lot that CRT could learn from the activist history that's currently being made here in Los Angeles, and that's previously been made by our ancestors and other organizations. So with that in mind, I kind of expanded the prompt beyond just what CRT could learn, but what the CRS program at UCLA Law could learn from the local activist histories here in Los Angeles. And that led me to think specifically about the legacy of the Southern California chapter of the Black Panther Party, which was headquartered in Los Angeles, as well as Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, because they're both, I would say, prime examples of what I call revolutionary intercommunalism, in ways that could evolve and fortify CRT and the CRS program from attacks that are politically motivated or otherwise. So just to get into a little bit of this theory that I thought was important was revolutionary intercommunalism, which was theorized by founder Huey P. Newton in his speech Uniting Against the Common Enemy on October 23rd, 1971. So recently past date, but he specifically talks about recognizing how we are no longer just nations being oppressed, but instead interwoven communities that are being oppressed by a common enemy, yet have the potential to unify in ways specifically around community survival programs that will allow us to defeat that common enemy, which is racism and global oppression. I thought that was a theory that really comports well with CRT's radical roots, challenging racism, challenging racial oppression, as well as injustice in a concrete way on the ground, right? Really, the Southern California chapter of the Black Panther Party had a variety of community programs, but specifically their community health clinic, their political education was something that stood out to me, as well as their abolitionist framework in terms of point 8 of the 10-point program, wanting to eliminate all prisons and jails, and freeing all people from prisons and jails in the United States, county, state, local, and federal. They also had an anti-war stance, so they had a global perspective that I think was worth paying attention to. But they also had multiracial collaboration as well with the Brown Berets. And I think this was specifically exemplified on December 8th, 1969, when the LAPD and SWAT deployed to actually raid their office on 41st and Central and had a 5-hour shootout with the Panthers. The community actually came out in support, as well as Angela Davis, as well as the Brown Berets, in that moment to try to provide support to the Panthers during this shootout, where no Panthers were actually killed, but they actually were all able to get off from the charges as well. So these examples of multiracial collaboration as well as support, I think, are important. It's important to remember that resistance, right? Like, you have a right to self-defense. You have a right to defend yourself in these ways. And seeing how CRS can build in ways to have these types of, I think, resistance infrastructure that's needed during these times when we're facing a rise in authoritarianism, fascism, and the elimination of history that's needed for us to build a better world rather than getting swept up into Americanism or what we're being told is history, right? I also thought Black Lives Matter Los Angeles was important to examine as a contemporary example of revolutionary intercommunalism. And I just want to bring it back to a quote that Professor Melina Abdullah, who's one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, stated. She said, "Don't look for a comfortable place in oppression. Community is the solution." And I think that's important to recognize, right? Don't look for a comfortable place in oppression. Community is the solution. And I think in this moment where CRTs come under attack, often from the Trump administration, different executive orders, I think that you can get cabined into thinking that this is only an intellectual doctrine that doesn't have the same community roots and support that it could or should in these moments to be empowering people. But instead, I think it has room to grow and grow outside of this campus, outside of this program in certain ways as things change. And I've seen how BLMLA tries to integrate itself into the community, both by its abolitionist stance, its opposition to state-sanctioned violence, its collaborations with families affected by state-sanctioned violence, its policy work, including SB 2, the police decertification bill, Measure J, getting Jackie Lacey to lose her job, Chief Beck losing his job, Chief Villanueva losing his job, but also its formation of multiracial coalitions, whether that's with White People for Black Lives, whether that's with other allies, whether that's the Check the Sheriff Coalition. Their approach to forming community support is something that I think broadens their impact and significance, but also their protection from political attacks that can come from the media or political sources as well. I also think their commitment to mutual aid is something that's important to recognize. So understanding that LA has a history of revolutionary intercommunalism, I wanted to understand what that could look like if that was instituted more for the CRS program here at UCLA Law. Some of the suggestions I came up with were specifically grounding theory in community practice via involvement with social justice movements, whether that's creating some type of clinic or some type of other involvement to where to collaborate with other community organizations. I thought it was important to develop community accessible educational materials. Although CRS is a program specifically at UCLA Law, I think we have a responsibility to the communities that we claim to serve and represent to make things user-friendly. As Assata Shakur talked about in her poem, The Revolution is Love. I think we have a responsibility to make things user-friendly. Then third point, I thought building intersectional cross-disciplinary coalitions, similar to what the Black Panther Party built with the Brown Berets, similar to what BLMLA builds with the Check the Sheriff Coalition, BAJI, as well as Measure J. I think that's more of the involvement that could strengthen CRS as a program and CRT as an intellectual doctrine. Then really developing alternative user-friendly media platforms for CRT dissemination, right? Hopefully this panel and other things will be accessible to individuals. So we're already working on making these forms of conversation and forms of discourse user-friendly, because not everybody's gonna read a full paper, but people like to engage, whether that's in podcasts, whether that's in panels, whether that's in other forms of media that are yet to be developed. And we have a responsibility to continue to advance in that direction and evolve. Then I also think it's important to sustain intergenerational leadership in CRS graduates. I don't know exactly how that would take form, but there should be a way that we're connecting and interacting in an environment so that we're keeping this doctrine alive and well. We're keeping each other up to date, as well as seeing ways that we can support and develop each other in ways that we're not looking for from other programs, that we're not looking for from the next degree or credential that we might think we need. I also want to make sure that I'm shouting out the work that's done in Leimert Park by the Africatown Coalition to collaborate with other organizations and do mutual aid, as well as the organizing and history of work that the Community Coalition does here in Los Angeles as their link to the Brown Berets. I think really the goal of my paper is for critical race studies to take critical race theory from an academic discipline to a catalyst for social justice innovation and community empowerment here in Los Angeles. That could take the forms of know your rights clinics, but really a whole community clinic that could be housed here, certain things like jail support, mutual aid, or legal observer training, just from my own experience. So really, I think there's much to be done, but as the Panther said, dare to struggle, dare to win. And in these moments, I think that there's the potential to build. We just have to continue to challenge the narratives in front of us as well. So continue to grow, continue to strengthen yourself, and all power to the people.
Right on. Thank you. Thank you to all three of you really for making this panel about the sense of urgency, not only around the moment that we're living, which there's been a lot of discussion over the last 3 days, that there is a specific target right? On folks who are doing the simple work of naming racism as a real thing, much less those who are doing the hard work of trying to make the connections that these panelists are making. But I am especially drawn to an underlying theme here, which is the long tradition in critical race theory to question what the existing remedies offer us and how we could go beyond existing remedies. You heard a lot of ideas and suggestions from the panelists, ranging from what happens in the courts to what happens on the streets. So what our vision was to really open this up as a conversation with those of you who took the time to be here with us today, and to have you pose your questions based on what you heard, and then we'll just get into a conversation about any of these themes. So I will open the floor.
Hi everyone, thank you and good morning. I was just curious from the standpoint of trying to bridge between theory and practice. You know, we're having conversations about abolition and legal scholarship, but we're in a moment of backlash. We're spending so much time talking and critiquing doctrine that we're not really able to dive into the theory, to dive into like what's happening on the ground. I mean, there's clear exceptions. I think Amna Akbar does this best, but I'm just like wondering, like, how are you approaching that bridging work? Like, how are you approaching what you spend your time on? Because honestly, there can be so much time spent on trying to establish legitimacy for the communities that we work with and alongside. It can be that all time is spent critiquing. I'm really asking because I mean, this is what I try to do, and oftentimes I wonder if I'm just spending so much time like facing the state and trying to talk to the state. And so just like tips on that. I thought, Ade, your interventions were like very helpful, because I think as professors we do have to connect this to real life. But for any of us teaching doctrinal, we have to spend what 95% of the time talking, it seems like, about things that are going to be on the bar exam, or you know, to do right by the students in one sense, but they want something else. So I don't know, just really and truly, like what do we think is the path if we're going to try to bridge this? Like, how can we do that? What are some strategies? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Dave?
Yeah, for starters, right, I think we're in a moment where we're building a lot of what we don't see, right? Like, we're having to do things outside of common frameworks. You know, like, I'm not a teacher, right? So I don't know about the different doctrinal things you're required to teach, but from the outside of seeing what I think young people in the community is looking for from legal scholars, from legal individuals, a lot of it, right, is not a long article, right? They're looking for people who are showing up and consistent and have heart and willing to talk to people in a respectful way, you know, who are willing to be present. So I think sometimes, you know, my mom tries to discourage me sometimes from like, sometimes you can't try to drink the ocean, right? And I think that's a lot of what we do in trying to talk to the state to legitimize like the work we do and the struggles we do. But then when we're connecting to try to have an impact amongst our people, I think there's a way that we have to still be in community, right? I don't think the time that I spent at UCLA, to be completely honest, I was the most connected to my community and the people that I really wanted to serve. And I think that's led to me having a little bit of a, not the most linear path in my professional journey in this moment. So I think it's a really strong piece that you're doing something that you're passionate about, but also just like remembering, you know, for your passion, you set, you know, your internal compass to the 3 things you want to affect, right? And trying to figure out, okay, maybe you start with those 3 things so you're not trying to affect all of, you know, state-sanctioned violence in a certain way, but you're able to find an organization that, you know, connects to the things you care about, right? You know, Kwame Ture talked about, like, there's a difference between mobilization and organization, in the sense that, like, mobilization, you're trying to get people around issues, but organization, you're trying to overturn the system. And seeing that you're in a position of academia, there's a way that I think you can organize differently to try to start opposing the system. But it starts with forming those core group of individuals that you can trust, that you can work with, that you can workshop some of these ideas around. And especially in this time of like surveillance, I would say like repercussion and like intentional white lash as well as Zionism, you have to be especially careful with who you're allowing to collaborate with in these ideas to try to change things. So it's not a moment of we're we're too late, but I think the moment is now to start trying to build those connections, because we are the adults. I saw a video online, they're saying we are the ancestors now. In that moment that we saw in history with this backslide into fascism and authoritarianism, like we're in that moment where people are taking pictures that are gonna go into history books in one of these moments here and there. And realizing that like the moment's now to step up, the rise is now to try to start building, and it's not like the moment to look for somebody else or for somebody else to start doing it. I think we're each called and have that potential. You know, Nipsey Hussle had a quote in his song, like, no matter what you're into, no matter what you've been through, I just want you to know you got something to contribute. And I think that's a lot of what's lost. And sometimes what happens when we get isolated into these ivory towers in places of academia, that we often overcomplicate it in thinking that it's just papers, when really, you know, sometimes the youth want to just be able to talk to somebody. They want to be able to be somewhere. You know, they want to be able to have someone accessible to know that just this is possible to get this far. Not, you know, what did you have published last year and what have you, but finding that community, that small group of individuals that you can righteously build to change the material conditions in your community is an ongoing process. And I'm just want to continue to encourage you to do so in the places where you are, because that's what revolutionary intercommunalism is really about. Seeing the community's needs and then stepping up to meet them. I often say the challenge for the contemporary revolutionary is, how do you maximize yourself for the movement, right? How do you bring those skills, expertise, and experiences you would normally bring to the 9-to-5 job to the people in a user-friendly and accessible way? And I think that's the challenge in that moment, and the tension you're feeling is very real, but it means you're doing something right.
Thank you for that.
Can I jump on top of that as well? So, as an academic, I had imagined myself writing articles on analytic legal philosophy, and that's where I'm comfortable. But I think if you want to engage, what you need to do is put yourself in public spaces. And there are different forms of public spaces that you can, and you can either participate or you can listen. So the public space that I'm most participatory in is the Sybil Bryan Commission for Institutional Inspections, which is the County Jail Commission. I know Kelly I was actually just reading a minutes in which you were mentioned. I think you and I just missed each other. But that space, or the Civilian Oversight Commission, if you participate in that, is a place where people come and tell you about what's going on in the LA County Sheriff's system. And so you can participate there. But what we were doing in the lead up to the convening, and then what Alison Rubenfeld, our Equal Justice Works fellow, has been doing since, is going to spaces where organizers are organizing and being present there and listening. And these spaces can seem really alien if you're an academic, because they're messy spaces, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
And they're not spaces where you're going to be able to do quantitative research, but they are spaces where you can begin to understand why people are angry, what they need, and also, you know, in developing relationships out of that. For instance, we spoke to some folks in Compton who part of the struggle was to help folks who had just left school, that are now, you know, that recognize that the way they were policed was unusual, that they shouldn't expect to be tailed by sheriffs, picked up, kicked out, picked up by them, dropped in another area, all that kind of stuff, because this was just usual to them. And there were a variety of other things that, you know, I hadn't expected to hear about, that I think they hadn't expected to hear about, and you learn about the hidden practices by being in those spaces, speaking to people and learning from them. And so that's what I would recommend doing. And that gets you out of, but that often means you have to get out of a comfort zone and into a difficult for an pointy-headed academic.
Thank you, Eric. Felipe, do you want to speak to this question? Or you...
I think they covered it. I have some.
Yeah, you were out there getting tear gassed.
Yeah.
So you can talk well about this.
As he was writing an article about how it is.
Yeah, I could talk about it, but I think better save some time for another question.
Other question? Kelly?
Thank you so much for this. I'm already inspired and go home and rewrite some stuff because of what I've heard this morning. I wanted to bring together, and I'm sorry, Felipe, I came in a little bit late, and so I hope I don't mischaracterize some of the work that you did. I wanted to connect maybe Eric's work and Felipe's work a little bit and ask a question. I love the way that you're using an abolitionist framework, historical abolitionist framework, and applying it to immigrant detention. And then, Eric, I love your formulation of reparations about addressing harm, right? That's not necessarily community specific. And so I wanted to think alongside you all, and you may not have thought about this very much, and so we're kind of talking out loud together, but do you have a sense of what a reparations project, either as a praxis or a set of demands, would look like in the immigration realm, given how much harm immigration control has committed against numerous communities across more than 2 centuries at this point. And at this moment, we're so under siege, the demands that are coming out of the movement are protective, like stop the raids, or at its most radical, a pathway to citizenship for all. But I love this, how can we begin to push into abolition, yes, but reparations as well, and maybe on the ground you've heard something. Anyways, I wanted to kind of bring those two things together. If you have thoughts on that, I know it's not exactly what you're working on, but maybe if we talk out loud a little together.
Sure. What do you want? Sure. I think being on the street, people say in Spanish, "Solo quiero vivir mi vida." I just want to live my life, right? And so, think a reparations model of what does it look like to fully and completely, holistically support an individual's ability to live their life. And it starts from the source of displacement. We can start there, for example. So reparations could look at it as an international framework on how the U.S. military is the biggest police force in the world, and looking at interventionist policies, for example, and how those continue under all administrations, and particularly now with this renewed framing by the Trump administration of the war on drugs, but also carried on by Kamala Harris. And for example, the Biden administration worked to equip police and military in Central America to conduct stops and to stop people from going to Mexico. And then it worked to do the same in Mexico. So and we understand, of course, that part of the reason people are displaced is imperialism and capitalism. So I think starting there from a reparations model, what that looks like is both domestic and international. There has to be both of those focuses, and also in the transnational, meaning people moving through different countries. Here at the national level, I've heard people expressing frustration, for example, at their inability to vote. And while participating in a system that perpetuates oppression may seem like a non-reformist reform, expanding the franchise to vote for individuals who are in the country can be a pathway towards getting more participation in this so-called democracy. Other things that individuals, in looking at the history of abolition, is actual monetary compensation from the federal government, and we understand that there is this corporate capture in communities where our money is going to weapons and weapons manufacturers and corporations, and then people in the immigrant community are seen as good if they're able to, I forget what was the phrase you used that day was find a way to make oppression work or something?
Comfort in oppression.
Yeah,
Find comfort in oppression.
Yeah, don't look for a comfortable place in oppression.
Right. And so folks are experiencing wage theft, folks are experiencing housing insecurity, folks are experiencing all of those. And so reparations looks like universal health care, looks like universal right to housing, universal basic income, and those are, I think, pathways towards a more long-term conversation of stopping the sources, I think, of what is causing displacement. But yeah, I'll stop there, but I let Eric and others chime in.
Yeah, so I'll try and be quick because I want to. So I think the thing that reparations can focus on is what's the remedy? What are the goods that we want, rather than necessarily talking about. So we need to talk about what the injuries are, but we also need to talk about what the remedies for those injuries are. And so although reparations isn't necessarily about a revolution, it is at least talking about what it looks like to be part of a healthy, valued community. And quickly, so I agree with everything. I think you've got it exactly. Two things I will say. One, at the convening, a lot of Latino Chicano members of the convening thought that reparations was a black thing. And I think we need to make sure that, and a lot of black people think that reparations is a black thing. And so I think we need to think about ways in which reparations is, as you point out, not tied necessarily just to enslavement and the descendants of enslaved people, but there are many different types of reparations. So that's first. And not to say that there isn't a black reparations thing, but there are other reparations things too. But then we get back into a series of political battles, deal with that. The second thing I want to say is, fundamentally for me, reparations is about joy. It's the right to experience joy. Black and brown joy. And I think what it is really important to recognize is how threatening public expressions of black and brown joy is to white people. Black and brown joy equals white fear. And so part of reparations has to be reclaiming public spaces for the liberatory experience of joy, which I think ties to your Asante Shakur poem on love. I think that's fundamental. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Can we take a third question, and then we'll come back to see if we can add to that?
No, we're good.
Okay, all right, perfect.
I'm a first year law student, and I came to school under the impression that lawyering is like a harm reductive project. So I was wondering, is there like liberation lawyering, or are there people for liberation who are lawyers? Like, are those, on opposite sides of dialectic, like, can't be held together necessarily?
One, that's a great question, and it's great you're here. When I was a first-year law student, I wasn't going to Symposium, so shout out to you.
This is the best. This is like the best use of my time since I got here, probably.
Exactly. I would definitely agree with that. Just from what you're saying, I come from an anthropology background in undergrad, and just like one of the critiques of development is the assumption of unilinear progress. So it's hard for me to tell you like there's liberation attorneys, because I think liberation's a process that's ongoing. I think people are figuring out how do you resist in a lot of newer ways, how do you continue to develop, because I think the reliance on law being presumed to be liberatory kind of leads to the situation we're in now, where so many protections are being rolled back, whether it's voting rights, whether it's bodily autonomy for women, whether, we can go on and on about different things. I think when I was in your seat, they were telling me, oh, the Supreme Court would never, take away this or do that, but then we're seeing it happen case after case. I think it's important to, in your position, trying to figure out how do you want to move the needle, right? What are the 3 issues you want to affect with your career? And not just see networking as going to events and meeting people, but what type of community are you really trying to join, right? I do think there are liberatory lawyers out there. I think it's I guess often called like movement lawyering, because I think it's not the lawyers that are pushing the change, it's the people. The people are the ones that are going to set us free and are going to lead to their own liberation. It's not, in my opinion, going to be the lawyers mostly. I think we have a role to play in liberatory movements, but that doesn't mean that we're at the front or at the center of most of them. Although that's like what's often uplifted and blown up to us in the media about what lawyering is, I think the actual creation of liberation is the support of the people as they develop their own consciousness and then eventually are able to seize the means of production and seize the time and oppose oppressors. But that's a process, right? It's not a conclusion. So just continue to refine yourself. Asada Shakur talks about it in that poem, you know, becoming a weapon of mass destruction. Becoming a weapon of mass construction, specifically. And I think as a lawyer, you have a great potential to be that weapon of mass construction for people, for movements, and for causes that you very much believe in.
Thank you, Ade.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Law is not justice. Law is an exercise of power. White supremacy, right? So that's all. If you come into law school understanding that, your 1L courses are teaching you the architecture of power in this country specifically. And I remember I brought in like black Marxism into classroom and talking about property, and the property professor just hated it. He didn't want to talk about the how law was used for oppression. He just wanted to say this is property law, and struggled with me specifically. Same with contracts and same with other classes. But I think that's, and I agree with Ade, liberation is a process, just like abolition is a process. And so if you are in this position of privilege to be here, for example, and learning about the architecture, going back to the first question, when you're on the streets, a lot of individuals still they are conditioned in this country to believe that the law in the United States is just, it's on courthouses, and that law and order. You hear that said regularly, not only by judges, but by people on both sides of the political aisle. And you hear that people repeat it on the streets. And I think people in community understand the reality that law is not just, but there's some comfort in believing that myth. And because if the reality is different, that you're experiencing, but you'd be like, oh, there's got to be some law. There's a law. You're a lawyer. You understand. There's got to be something that protects me. If there's not, then what are we left with? We're left with community, right? But if it's easy to say you're left with community, but we lived in such a disconnected, disjointed world that's increasingly becoming more fragmented. I think if you understand law as serving a role of maintaining that order and hierarchy to facilitate the exploitation of people, and maintain and legitimize state violence, approaching that and questioning professors and asking them that, I think that is how you can use your legal education for when you are a lawyer, understand there's some good I can do. We can get people out of jail today for protesting. And that's material good. They're no longer in the system. Is that an abolitionist approach? Are we getting rid of jails? No. But we are able to go in there and use our law degree and represent people to get them out. For example, visiting people in detention centers and bringing a conditions claim. Are we going to abolish the system that way? No. But we're able to represent people and try to get them some goods. So law can be used as a tool for the overall struggle.
Next question. Yep.
I wanted to add something just to this, if I may. I also think it's important to think about ourselves as protagonists who are able to create liberated zones wherever we are and wherever you are in your journey. This is a liberated zone right here, right now, and you are a law student right now, and you don't have to be in the lawyer role to see what is making you feel that this was one of the most worthwhile moments in your law school career. That internal voice, I think, is also the most important thing to nurture, because there's something in our instinct that is built around our ancestors surviving a project that was designed to produce class hierarchy, racial oppression, gender oppression, all of it. And I would just say also, it's important to learn through conversation intergenerationally with the faculty who are here, have been here at different moments, through alums, what students have done to produce liberated zones and also push the framework forward. Last night's panel, I referenced what it was like to be here when the first generation of Muslims, South Asians, Middle Easterners who had lived through 9/11 as high school students made it to law school. And what it meant that a CRT program didn't have a CRT in the Global War on Terror class. And so we created the work group. And other areas, disability and CRT, all of these areas that pushed the framework to where it is now were a result of not waiting to see how the particular discipline or practice or institutional setting that you end up doing your movement liberatory work in, but to just know you're in it already. There are questions here, and I'll come back to you.
I'd like to know more about the history of very successful interracial coalitions like Justice LA. Yeah, for a couple of reasons, in order to raise up and celebrate the people that put that together, and perhaps also to understand a model of how that can be replicated.
Can I also, before I hand it over we spoke about this example in the call, so I just want to lead with it and attach it back to what I was saying here in response to the student. One of the most successful examples, and there's an article in depth that was written about it, was around who broke the doors open for people of color to come into this law school. And in the spirit of revolutionary intercommunalism in the Panther tradition, what you will be left with in reading this piece is called Race, Class, and UCLA Law Admissions. It was published in the Chicano Latino Law Review. Is an arc of struggle by people from different communities to name what the law school was in the moment of the 60s trying to do to respond to the fact that, Watts was on fire and people were politicized and there were Panthers on campus, right across the way, Campbell Hall. And it's just an amazing, amazing arc all the way up to diversity admissions, which is what I came in through when we had no racial majority in this law school. To talk about an elite law school where there's no racial majority is unheard of right now, right? And we were uncomfortable with that diversity program because we felt like what it did was named us as the chocolate chips in the batter. And we thought, look, if we got to get rid of considerations of race and gender, which was what was on the table, nobody should get in on LSAT and GPA alone. This is a public good, back to the point around what reparations could look like. And we are in a state where the vast majority of poor people will never see a lawyer, and if they do, it's going to be somebody screw them over. And so if you're sitting in one of these seats, you owe it to people in the poorest zip codes of this state in a public law school to be of service there. And that should be the criteria that we look for when we're trying to admit people. What's the evidence that that's why you came to law school? And what are the conditions, including not having people graduate with tons of debt, that would make it possible for somebody to do that? But what I want to highlight to the interracial coalition piece is one of the things you'll learn there, which is when quotas were legal, the initial classes were quota classes, and the initial group of people came in and said to the administration, it is actually reproducing a harm for you to have a few of us here from each of these minority groups. We need a critical mass, and you need to expand the quota. And at that time, there were 5 quota slots for the black students, and the black students were involved in reviewing who those people would be that would be admitted into those spots. There were 5 spots to the Mexican American Law Students Association, MALSA and BALSA. They had a third world coalition. That's what they called themselves. They had an intergenerational critique, historical critique of the harms that the US had visited in all over the world. And they had an understanding that there were people from all parts of the world living in poverty in LA and never, ever thinking about themselves as folks who could come to this law school, that this was a place for them. And when they came to the administration and they said, where is the API affirmative action 5 slots? The administration said, well, Asian Americans didn't suffer racial harm in California. And it was the black and the Mexicans who said, you all don't know history, and we want API, affirmative action admissions. Administration said no. So what they did is they took one of each of their 5 spots and created the first Asian American affirmative action slots. And to me, the thing that was powerful about learning about the Critical Race Project was its willingness to put legal education and the law under the microscope around how it was not what Felipe told us people think it is, a vehicle for justice, but actually what one of the founders of the field calls a loaded weapon for racial injustice. So I would just lift up that example, and it's why I dedicated my time leaving here to community organizing that is dedicated ultimately to producing unity and cross-racial solidarity for social justice. And I think the issues around which we organize, I started with welfare reform, I'm doing stuff to abolish youth incarceration. They change over time based on the energy in the community, like where is their move, where are people willing to go? So the issues in the campaigns may change, but I think the frameworks that we work with and where we choose and how we choose to build community are really important ways to understand why those coalitions come to be and sometimes also why they end.
Sorry, which coalition were you said?
Justice LA.
Justice LA.
So part of what we were doing when we were setting up our convening was reaching out to the various groups that were involved in holding the sheriff accountable. And of course, Justice LA was one of the first groups we turned to because they have this overarching membership formed of the other different groups. And so I think that the Justice LA Coalition is really important, but it's also really fragile. Why? Because those different groups also have different agendas, and so even around the sheriffs. And so I think that Justice LA is a great example of intercommunalism. I'm not sure it's totally revolutionary intercommunalism. And I will say that one of the reasons why it is important is that intercommunalism in Los Angeles is so fragile. For the same reasons that it's fragile in the reparations movement nationally, everybody has a different understanding of the goals and agenda that they need to follow. And when we focus on communalism, so our communities rather than intercommunalism, we can often lose sight of the ways that we need to form coalitions in order to move forward. So I would celebrate Justice LA at the same time as recognizing that it has a lot of difficult work that it has to do in order to keep those coalitions together.
Thank you.
I didn't know as much about Justice LA, but I realized I kind of misspoke. I meant to say Central CSL and how they're connected.
Central
to
CSL, yeah.
Not the Community Coalition. But I think although the context of Los Angeles is different than a place like Chicago, where like the Rainbow Coalition existed between the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, and other groups like the Young Patriots, I do think Los Angeles has a strong history of resistance to rely on, such that there are people from different walks of life, different disciplines that are willing to stand up and resist in ways that are still valuable and call back to different movements regarding the Black liberation struggle, the Chicano struggles, as well as the Native Indian movement here, in large part because I think we're starting to realize that we're facing a common enemy, that it is going to take all of us in some type of way. Fred Hampton talked about how we don't have any people that we can lose in these movements in certain ways, and recognizing that the power that we're searching for often is found in community, is found in being involved with your neighbor, in really like revolution, not in the sense of we're going to go and overturn something directly, but in the sense that building and seeing each other in a different way allows us not to rely on the government or other political institutions in a way. So I think coalition work that largely happens in Los Angeles does have that revolutionary potential, even if it doesn't always lead to the revolutionary results, because it's empowering to be together, it's empowering to be in your community, but it's also necessary. I often say, you know, a united fist is more powerful than a bunch of separate fingers when you're fighting, in my opinion. So.
Do you want to add anything, Felipe?
Good, we want to take another question to end?
Okay.
Just a quick one. Where can we read your articles or your papers? Have you been published yet? Or?
Mine's not published.
Not
so-
published.
I'm still working on mine.
No pressure. It's very easy.
Yeah, and that's part of the function of this. And I would just say, you know, the idea of producing knowledge that has these premises as a point of departure is a radical intervention for academies that were designed, that were built around eugenicist research, right? Things that were normalized about who we are, passed as scholarship. And we're sitting here with folks who are speaking truth and who are lifting up this tradition about how we work across these manufactured lines to do something different. And that is a revolutionary intervention. There was another hand in the back. Go ahead.
Hi, I really enjoyed this panel. I feel bad asking this question now because there's 3 minutes left, but.
If anybody wants to stay over, I think there's a break in between and you can stay.
You might have, you know, I'm just curious about how you're thinking about this work in like this age of all these digital technologies. On one level, you know, there's like this desire, I write in the area of law and technology and racial justice, and there's like this desire to talk about misinformation and disinformation as they're somehow new, when we know that there's a long legacy of that. But I do think that there are ways in which these technologies have eroded communities and have have this allure of being community building when they're not, because of the way that they're designed. They're not designed to be community building, they're designed to be profitable for, you know, the companies that create them. And so I was just kind of curious to the extent, like, you know, your experience, honestly, of like, do you feel like, you know, mobilizing in this moment is harder with these technologies at play? You know, how, are you seeing anything about that? I just was kind of curious.
I have a quick quote, again, once from Huey P. Newton as well, one of the founders of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, as well as he had his PhD in political science, and he has this quote like, "The spirit of the people is greater than the man's technology." I do believe that technology has put movement work into a different phase than it once was in the 60s, for sure. I don't think you can deny that. I do think that it's largely used as a distractive tool to keep people largely pacified and not involved in their own resistance. So I think it does have an impact. I think that it's still important to be involved and use technology as well, so you're aware of the tools that your enemy are using. I think it's very astute what you pointed out, that propaganda's been a tool in the United States for decades, almost since America's existed. And I think largely we're moving, you know, I don't want to like quote Dave Chappelle here, but he talked about how we're in this era of spin, right? Like even before AI is coming out making these videos, it's hard to tell almost what's real and what's not. And I think it's only going to continue to be generated and occurring. But then understanding that power comes from people that you know, right? When you can verify whether is this thing real eventually, or when you could have a radical conversation with somebody about something that concerns you rather than looking to the media or for something created by these apps, because just like you said, they're created by companies that don't have the people's interest in mind or really communal interest in mind at all. So continuing to be aware of technology, still trying to be involved and figure out how to use it for positive benefits is important, and just continuing to stay involved in a certain way as well. That's really important these days.
We're at time, so let's give them a round of applause. They have like 30 seconds left to pitch. There's another round of concurrent panels. But I would like to build on where Dave finished, which is, yes, we want to turn to people we actually know, especially in this moment where we're almost like in a counterfactual moment, right? Like facts are not, like, you know, they could just be an opinion around where something is a fact or not. But I want to go back to something you said earlier, which is around the abolitionist tradition of centering love. And for me, the technology question I've had this struggle because as my younger nephews and nieces are coming up in a completely different terrain, I have to confront that the technologies that are raising them are actually giving them worldviews, worldview analysis. And I can either be judgmental and be like, well, that's what happened when you spend all your time on the phone or whatever, or I could come to terms with it around what it's producing in the world. And so for me, I've tried to take that question to when there are moments that technology is used towards liberation, I need to understand what happened, such as what's happening with the communities organizing, using social media so effectively to build one of the most sophisticated, I think history will tell, community responses to repression, right? And probably one of the factors that is gonna take us from this moment to what's possible. And at the same time, I just want to leave you with this story. One of the abolitionist victories we had recently in our organizing here locally was to convert a sorority into a residential program for currently incarcerated youth to finish their sentences in the community as a proof of concept of what abolition is, so long as they were interested in being enrolled in community college. If the state can tell me when you get out for having committed X crime, you're gonna go to this state office and see a parole officer, the state can send me to a community college, a different state entity. It's not rocket science. It's about who we believe and what we believe these people can be. The first cohort of young men who were not there for shoplifting, who did 5 years of their 7-year sentence, were all young black and brown men for very poor communities where we're talking about organizing. All of them thought they were going to get rich on crypto, loved Donald Trump. These are black and brown young men with serious criminal records who saw themselves in the MAGA project. And I had to, as the instructor in a bridge program, was like, I'm just going to do a simulation of my course, which is about formerly incarcerated people fighting for social justice, try to prepare you for community college, was to step back and say, okay, so this is baseline information. I'm not going to pathologize this. All of our youth are struggling with having phones in their hands and not being able to focus on what you're teaching. But this is information for us, right? We have to figure out how to generate the TikTok version of these principles and put them out there. And I think we're seeing really good examples of that. So thank you for being here. One more round of applause.